So some land reform experts have criticised the recent update on redistribution as announced by Agriculture and Land Reform Minister Thoko Didiza last week. Many have criticised the developments as lacking clarity and also failing to address pressing questions. Didiza announced Cabinet had approved 60 of the 73 recommendations in the report of the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. The panel was appointed in September last year to advise government on circumstances in which the policy of land expropriation without compensation should be implemented. So to discuss this further, we're now joined in our Durban studio by Laurel Oettle, who is the Director of Association for Rural Advancement, or AFRA. And it's good to have you with us. Thanks very much, Laurel, for being our guest.
Great, thanks so much for having me with you, and good morning to all your viewers.
What was your general take on the latest update by Minister Didiza?
Well, I think, as you said in your introduction, there has been quite widespread frustration with the announcement in terms of particularly the lack of detail. But I think there's also a lot that we need to really look at the details of and see the positive aspects of. So while she spoke in detail about the recommendations that have not been approved or that still need further discussion, I think a lot of people are overlooking the 60 recommendations that have been approved and seeing that there is a huge amount of rich detail that was analysed by the panel. This is not an easy topic. I think everyone knows how emotive, how complex the land issue is in South Africa. So I think a multi-stakeholder panel that managed to bring a multiplicity of views and opinions into one report in fairly tight timeframes that has been meaningfully engaged with by Cabinet is something that we should see as an important step forward.
So you talk about those 60 that have been approved. What are the standout ones for you?
Well, one of the things that really stands out for me is that government is finally taking seriously the need for a land administration framework. And while they haven't fully endorsed all of the recommendations in this regard, they are taking very concrete action in terms of starting to look at how a much more inclusive, robust land administration system can be developed for South Africa. The panel itself had recommended that land administration be seen as the new fourth pillar of land reform, together with looking at tenure reform, redistribution and restitution. And that is an issue that civil society and academics have been arguing for decades is a crucial missing element in how to make land reform real in South Africa. We need concrete mechanisms that allow us to do that and to move forward. So I think we really need to pause and celebrate the fact that land administration is being taken seriously now, and work is beginning to happen in government to develop a more inclusive framework that will address the needs of all of our citizens rather than just a few.
Yeah, there are a couple of recommendations, however, that Cabinet have actually rejected. Just some to look at. They rejected to a land reform fund to assist with the expropriation of land without compensation. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think that was an unfortunate rejection of that recommendation, because when the panel made that recommendation, they were really trying to look at how can different actors come together to support land reform. So I think just pushing it into the sphere of government and saying government is fully responsible for land reform, government must implement it on its own, has failed. And I think there's many citizens, many voices, including from organised agriculture and from those of us in civil society who represent marginalised citizens, are saying we need to all come to the table. We need government to see us as partners and to have a more inclusive process and more transparent process of land reform. Our analysis of land reform budgets has shown that they have been actually shrinking in real terms if you look at the trajectory throughout the democratic era. So government is now saying they think the budget are sufficient if they are used effectively. But we don't agree that the budgets are sufficient. We think there's much more capacity needed, much faster turnaround needed on all different elements of land reform. And in terms of expropriation without compensation, the fact that farmers, organised agriculture and other spheres such as churches are willing to step forward and say, let's have a more inclusive process, a fund that can be more widespread in how it supports land reform. Personally, I think that should have been welcomed by government. So I think, it is unfortunate that they feel that the current framework that has been insufficient will somehow now become enough.
Yeah, there's still a sense that there's still no proper or adequate explanation of the whole or clarity surrounding the expropriation of land without compensation. Did you get enough out of it? Because people still saying, there needs to be more clarity, and this is the biggest issue around this, and how we as South Africans need to know more about what this actually means and entails. Your understanding into it?
Well, I think there's two elements to it. I think the first is to really understand the purpose of the briefing. I think a lot of the frustration that people are feeling at the moment is because they'd really hoped for much more concrete information around policy direction from government. But I think we need to understand that this briefing was simply around saying which of the panel's recommendations Cabinet had supported and which they have not. That is an important step so that government can now move forward much faster in terms of mapping how they will develop policies that will now match these recommendations and make them concrete. So you can understand the frustration. People want to see exactly what is land reform going to look like moving forward. Yeah. There's been decades of failure. We need to start seeing successes, and we need to have a better understanding of how those successes are going to be realized. But I think this is where we need to, and I think we need the public also in our country to be educating themselves on how to engage in policy-making processes, how they happen, what the different steps are, and to see that government have committed, and Didiza herself was saying that they will be coming up with very concrete policies that will be out for public consultation in the very near future. So I hope people look out for that and engage with it meaningfully. In terms of expropriation without compensation itself, certainly she dodged that question, but I think it's fair enough to say that there are a series of processes that are moving forward. There have been, public consultations. There have been hard work done by Cabinet. The amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution is currently out for public comment, and that is open for comment until the 31st of January 2020. So government can't proceed with concrete policy to implement a change that hasn't actually been passed yet. So, as I said, I understand the frustration. People want to really see what is this going to look like, how is it going to be implemented. But there are, unfortunately, a number of steps we have to go through first. Yeah. So I, again, would urge people to continue to engage with the process, to go and look at the amendment that's been proposed to the Constitution, and to make their voices heard, because that's the only way to make our democracy real, and to feel that we each have a say in how land expropriation without compensation proceeds in South Africa.
Yeah, that I think a lot of people were looking to that announcement and hoping that would be the clarity that, whether it be South Africans, international investors, anybody that owns land or is wanting to own land would get a couple of answers. But I think there was a bit of disappointment that there wasn't enough clarity. But again, as you say, this is a complicated issue. We need to wait on that a bit. What they did announce as well is that Cabinet needed a little bit more time and needed to further engage on certain issues. What does that mean?
Well, it means that some of the recommendations that were made, for example, around urban land. So there's been a huge push to say that our cities need to become more inclusive. We need to undo apartheid geography that is still very entrenched in our cities. And with enormous amounts of migration to urban areas, we've all seen the absolute lack of adequate affordable housing. And a need to relook at the urban land challenges. Government said, Cabinet broadly supports the need to look urgently at urban land reform, but the mechanisms for that are quite complex, and so there needs to be a bit more engagement, more around how this is undertaken. So that's just one example of the issues where they're saying they broadly support the call. They understand that there is an urgent need to relook at urban, peri-urban land and housing needs.
Yeah, and town planning. We need to really have a look at something along those lines. Another big issue, and this one is, I think, a massive one to talk to, and that, of course, is the Ingonyama Trust Act. So the panel, what we know, recommended that either it would be reviewed or scrapped altogether, but there seems again to be no movement there. And again, I bring the voices of critics here. One actually saying that they dealt with, this is Dr. Donna Hornby, a land reform and agricultural researcher at the University of Western Cape's Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, quoting to say, to put it bluntly, the minister's response dodged the hard issues and reinforced pie-in-the-sky policies that have proved to be ineffective. That was her sort of summary of what was said. So I move back to the Ingonyama Trust. So why is it so difficult for government to make a decisive conclusion on this matter? And I'm going to throw the whole land without compensation conversation into it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a highly contentious issue indeed, and I think a very difficult one for government to tackle. But the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that they should be avoiding it. Yeah. And I think I do want to also mention that the high-level panel that assessed key legislation in 2015 and 16 made also very strong recommendations around the Ingonyama Trust and the fact that rural citizens who live on trust land are having their rights undermined, and that this is a crucial issue for our democracy. It is also a very emotive issue, as many land issues are. It's also a political issue. So yes, I think we are very concerned that government will continue to dodge the issue. I think we are very concerned about the range of bills that are entrenching traditional leadership at the cost of citizens' own rights. So how Minister Didiza responded to this issue is saying that they are currently working on broadly looking at how tenure reform will happen in South Africa and how different kinds of rights will be recorded in different ways. So there's a review of the Deeds Registry Act. There's a review of looking at how can those living in communal areas and under traditional leadership, including those within Ingonyama Trust land, be protected in terms of their rights and have those rights adequately recorded. Yeah. So again, I think to see it from both sides, on the one hand, we can see that it does make sense that we should have, as a democracy with a progressive constitution, we should have legislation that protects all of our citizens equally, not necessarily in the same way, but equitably. Yeah. So we do need reforms that it shouldn't matter whether you live on Ingonyama Trust land or in another communal area, that your rights should be equally and adequately protected, including from mining companies, where we see a lot of communities being displaced, particularly on Ingonyama Trust land, but also in other communal areas because their rights are not being adequately protected, and new legislation takes away the need for them to be adequately consulted and compensated. Yeah. So there are very real risks, and we need to keep a very close eye on how government will move forward on this. And I think that is, for me, one of the big takeaways from the briefing, that yes, people are frustrated that we didn't get concrete policy answers. But what we have is 60 recommendations that government has promised in the near future they will move forward on policy reform to meet those recommendations. That gives us a very clear framework to hold government to account. Yeah. So part of what we're doing at a national level as civil society, but also with other stakeholders, is developing monitoring systems to measure how government moves forward with policy, development and implementation, and how do those steps forward match up against what they've promised, match up against what Cabinet is now committing itself to, what government agencies now need to implement, but also against our Constitution, against our National Development Plan, and against international guidelines and best practice.
Just as
we do now have a very concrete way.
Good. As a closing, Laura, just to very quickly tell us now the way forward. I know you've spoken to it you've already spoken to it, but just what are the timeframes on all of this? I mean, when do you think, now that the panel's work has been done, where to now for government?
Yeah. So quickly, we have, within the first quarter of next year, we expect to see a roadmap coming from government in terms of exactly how they plan to implement these recommendations. We've already seen a number of policies that have been drafted and will be in the public domain for comment soon, including a donations policy, a policy looking at the beneficiary criteria for land redistribution. And there are more in the pipeline. So we can expect public consultation. We are very much going to hold government to their promise to be more consultative going forward. So I urge everyone to follow the process and to be fully engaged in it, particularly in the first quarter of next year, when we expect to see a number of policy directions being clarified. But bear in mind that Didiza was saying these are things that we need to debate and we need to decide together. That means everyone needs to step forward and bring their voice into the discussions. So we hope to see a lot more concrete policy emerging through 2020.
All right. Laurel, thank you very much. Thanks so much for unpacking this for us. Laurel Oettle is the director of the Association for Rural Advancement, taking us through the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Thoko Didiza's update regarding land reform and redistribution in the country. That leads us up to 7 o'clock here on this Monday morning. Let me hand you over to Sakina for our news bulletin on this, the 23rd of December. Morning, Sakina.